All right, let's have a word of prayer. We'll get started. Father, thank you for the beautiful day, privilege of opening the windows and just being refreshed by the sunlight and beauty of our campus. Thank you for our maintenance crew that works hard to keep it looking nice. Thank you for the privilege of reflecting on missions history. And I pray that as Matthew shares his presentation and as we continue on in our study, that you would encourage and challenge our hearts to the things that we experienced during this hour together. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, sir, I have the thing up. All you need to do is use your keys or whatever to advance when you're ready.
I just do a clicker thing, or
There is a clicker.
oh, I can use that and use the mouse.
Yeah, you can. Just a second. Here's the clicker right there if you want.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
I just click to the right and then use one of these.
Yes. So however you want to do it. Is it not working?
Nah, it's okay.
Try clicking on the screen, the presentation screen.
Oh, the hair right here? Oh,
Well,
that works.
But just now try that and see if it works.
Yeah,
there it goes. Yeah.
All right. Chose to do India. The reason for doing India, I'm not like a missions major like you guys. I'm out of school. I've never been to India. Sorry, that's helping me not be nervous, but I've never been to India. My local church, we have a missionary. His name's Ben Reiner. You've probably never heard of him. That's okay. Ben Reiner. Yeah, he's probably never heard of him. That's okay. He's in Mumbai, India. And this, I think it was last January, like in our college ministry, we had someone come and speak. They're like, hey, there's a missions trip. Like, we want to send college students to Mumbai, India. And I was very close in doing it. So I've been interested in India and just like hearing about how like Christianity is not like very well accepted there. It's kind of one of the lower religions, definitely very Hindu dominant, which kind of already talked about. Some general facts about India. I won't read them all online just to make you help the time out, but just some important facts. The population is 1.44 billion people. And just a comparison, like the U.S. population is only 334 million. I don't know how much the difference is, but I'm just going to say estimation. It's a lot bigger. So it's crazy to think about. It's located in South Asia. It's kind of an obvious one, but important to know. The size of India is, I thought this was crazy. I didn't know actually how big it was. It's 3,287 square kilometers, which I don't really know how big the U.S. is, but I'm going to say it's a lot bigger. It's interesting. I thought it was interesting. Just doing some like quick research. They said there's 23 official languages, and I don't know all of them. I know like Hinduism, or I don't know the correct term, but
Hindi.
Hindi. Yeah, sorry, Hindi. 80% of the population is Hindi, which is kind of an obvious one, but important to know. Some other important facts or population. I'm going to skip over that because I can't pronounce those hard words. The literacy rate, most people there can read well. Now, I don't know if it's like tied to a specific language or just in general.
Several languages, yeah.
Their GDP is 3.39 trillion, which sounds like a lot. I don't really know the U.S.'s. The inflation rate is 6.7%, which is double compared to the U.S. I put that down. I thought it was interesting. Their national debt is 2.43 billion. Life expectancy in India is, I think it's pretty similar to U.S., 67 years of age, which maybe that's high. I don't really know how accurate that is, but we're going to go with that. So this is like India, what it looks like on like a Google Maps, or like a little, I think it's like the Google Earth view.
Cool.
So some of the countries that have borders to the right is Bangladesh, and kind of to the left, upper corner is Pakistan. Some of the major seas is the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal Sea. So two major water sources next to it, and it borders two other countries. And there's Nepal, and I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's over there. Bhutan. I don't want to butcher it, but move on. I picked this image because I kind of thought it broke down India pretty well of like the different physical features it has. And I don't know exactly where like the most populated is. I did a little bit of research, and the Indian Ghats, I think it said over 50, or no, it's either the Indian or Western. I'm pretty sure it's Eastern. 50 million, or maybe it's, I think it's 30 to 50 million people live there. And the Central Highlands, the main like people group is the Telugu people group, and then the Western Chaps. I don't have my note card on me, but there's a certain tribe that like lived here. So then looking at India's physical features, there's I think I'm pronouncing it right. There's the Gats. Is that what you say? How do you pronounce
I
it?
don't know. That's
Okay, that's good. I don't feel as bad now. Okay. There's like plateaus, there's highlands, there's a desert, and they do have Himalayas on kind of that top corner there and over there in northeast India. So the religious and spiritual evaluation, I don't have a lot there, but I'll add to it. So I looked up like what is like the popular like religion like practice percentage wise, and I was able to find a couple of statistics. Hinduism, of course, being dominantly Hindi is the most popular. Over 600 million or 650 million people practice Hinduism. Islam is the next highest; it's 12.9%, and that's about 97 million people, which that's a lot. I was like, wow. And then I was surprised with Christianity. I mean, 18 million. That's a lot higher than I thought it was going to be. I thought it was a lot less. And kind of just so I talked about earlier, I had some buddies for a college group that served in a college ministry. They went to Mumbai, India, and just hearing from like some of their experiences, they said that like India is obviously very much into religion, but their issue is there is they're like, you go talk to them like, oh yeah, I believe in Allah or this many gods, and you're like, hey, like what do you think about like Jesus? And they're like, oh yeah, I'll worship Jesus too. And like the sad thing is like they're very much open to those conversations, but a lack of understanding is there's only one true God that leads to salvation. So that kind of breaks your heart a little bit. Also, too, I heard some experiences like I know in America we don't have like physical idols we worship. Like we have idols in our lives. Like there they have like certain temples they go and like they're worshiping an object, which is really sad. And like that's just some of the evaluation or just some testimonies I've heard about India, specifically in Mumbai, India. So the missionary activity, I did struggle to find research, and like I would have probably looked a little harder. I know there are specific missionaries who are in India. I know like you Google it and it doesn't really say. I don't think they're allowed to because it's a creative access nation. You can't just say like I'm a missionary in India. I did find some mission agencies that do like either they send trips or they like have people. I thought Mission India, it's interesting. They partner with locals there. So I know we talked about it in class. Instead of bringing like a foreign missionary there, they raise the people there to be missionaries in their home country, which I thought was super interesting. International missions boards. They send teams every year. They have like they have missionaries that go to India. They also have like for students or pretty much anyone, they have like short-term and long-term mission trip options. Same with the SEND network or the North American Missions Board. They send several missionaries each year, and there's options for like short-term and long-term trips for like a college student kind of interested in missions. They have options for that too, as well. So the conclusion, India is still dominated by Hinduism, but numerous missions agencies and missionaries are actively pursuing people of India. God is working through missionaries to spread his gospel, and it is evident that numerous people have a heart for India.
Good. Hey, great. You did the job. Just a couple of comments I'll make there. You did really well. Actually, India is now considered #1 in population, past China. In fact, not Josh Chatla's dad, but another missionary in South India actually thinks that it happened a while back because there are many, many tribes in India that haven't even been counted in the census. That may be true in China as well, but anyway, it's now considered #1. Regarding Christianity, 2.4%, a lot of those are Catholics, okay, because there was Catholic activity there in India, but there's still a good contingency of true believers as well. So, hey, you did a great job. Anybody have any questions for the man? Please no. Well, those are your sources. Good.
Oh, yeah.
That's fine. That's.
Do you have like a bibliography or?
Pew Research is really good. Rough Guides, yeah. Did you happen to take a look at all the Joshua Project? That's okay. It's not a problem. You did fine. The Joshua Project is a great source too, for stats and stuff like that. But yeah, good work. I can take care of closing that down for you.
Perfect.
Appreciate it. All right. Clara, do you have any questions? No? Okay, we'll move on. Interesting that you should choose India because today we're actually going to be talking about William Carey in India. We just have to finish up something that we didn't cover last week. And keep in mind that Friday, we have the reading, but I'm probably going to back up a little bit and try to bring some of chapter 3 in as well, as we have time. There's so much in that book. Okay, well, let's keep talking about the conflict here. And who's the conflict between? Do you remember the two missionaries that we're talking about here? This is not India. This is a totally different area.
Is that the guys in Greenland?
Yes. You happen to remember their names by chance?
Well, they're in my
That
notes.
easy
but
little
I
quiz
don't
we took
remember.
Friday.
Isn't one like David Christian?
Christian David.
Christian David. Okay.
Uh-huh. There was a guy that lived behind us where I grew up, and his name was David Christian. Yep, and he was, what was his background religiously? What group was he with?
Moravian.
Moravians, right. And the other guy, who was from Norway, what was his name?
Is it Henry? Or it started with an H.
Hans Egede. Yeah, it's all right. It's okay. A Norwegian guy that ended up staying there even when the support stopped coming from the throne in Norway. So these guys, and we talked about a lot of this, so I'm not going to take a lot of time. Just remember, they did have different personalities. That was part of the issue. David being much more laid back and maybe a gentle spirit, where Hans was a little bit more assertive. They had different methods of evangelism, where, you know, the Moravian view more of just loving them and telling them about Jesus, and Hans Egede said, no, we got to give them a good foundation. They need to understand theology, and there's a balance there somewhere, right? It's not either or. And I remember challenging you guys about this. Be careful if you're the newcomer on a field that you don't try to straighten out the old people that have been there, you know, and assume that their methods are all worn out and antiquated and no longer relevant and so on. Sometimes when a person is freshly out of college, he or she tends to feel like, okay, we're on the cutting edge, and these guys are still doing it the way they did it back in the 1980s. So you want to be careful about that. And then, did we talk about the smallpox epidemic showing up there? It was a huge deal. Remember, the smallpox was basically a European disease that the Native Americans suffered from, and the islanders in Greenland also suffered from. And so they, you know, some of them considered it to be the attack of the white man, the curse of the white man on them. But through the smallpox, from the reading, you may remember that Hans, who had a really, really hard time winning the people, he and his family helped the people who had smallpox actually expose themselves to it. And because of that, they were able to win the friendship of some of these Eskimo people, the native Greenlanders. So God used smallpox for an advantage. Then the idea of one sowing, another reaping. When David, we did the same thing you did, Laura, when Christian David showed up there, there wasn't much fruit. But then a lot of people started coming to Christ. And so, you know, somebody looking back might say, oh, Christian David is the one that really did the job there. He was the successful missionary. But that's not fair, because what Christian David did comes on the shoulders of 10 years of missionary history. Yeah.
Wasn't it like the book, when it was talking about it, it didn't even mention like Christian that much. It was more just like, it talked about Hans, however you say his name, more how he traveled around, and he was the one who like went into these people's tents and like really cared for them, so they saw through Hans the gospel.
Yeah.
So then, like, I don't know. I don't think you could even say that Christian. I don't even know what he did during that time.
Yeah, you're right. Most of the attention is given to Hans because of the situation. But I think that it would be easy for people to think that it's because of Christian David's influence coming there and being the more personal, warm-hearted guy that things began to happen. And that's just, I'm just saying that's not a fair statement. We really don't have any statistics about him. But let's just suppose that you're working kind of on your own. You're really struggling, you're trying, and then somebody else comes along that has a different kind of a personality, and all of a sudden things begin to happen. People are going to attribute that to the other person. This just happens. And Hans actually loses his sight, but remember, his sons really come in and help in the work, and through that, you know, they do see some fruit for the gospel. So it's just a neat story up in Greenland. All right, so there's Greenland, top of the world, man. And yes, I do think it is called an island, right? Can somebody just double check, Google largest island in the world, it should come up Greenland. It may come up Australia, but that's,
Is that just because it's only one
It
country?
says Greenland.
yeah, well, it is, yes, it's a country, it's one country, it's not a continent, correct. Yeah, it does say Greenland, yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so we're gonna switch gears. We're leaving Greenland and we're gonna go to, let me just go back to show the relationship. You can't even see India hardly on here. Okay, so forget that. Let's go back to, remember this I showed you at the beginning of the semester? So when we talk about William Carey, where we're going now, we're here. Right around, if you just remember 1800, that'll be fine. 1800 kind of gives you a good round figure for his ministry. And we call these the eras of modern missions. So when you think of the modern missions movement, think 1800 to the present, okay? And this chart kind of helps to show some of the reasons why it's called the modern missions movement, some of the things that happened here that weren't true in earlier missions history. Something. I'm gonna see if I can get this to work and sit over here in the shade. Sun is starting to get to me. Right? So, okay. Wait. Is there a delay in this thing? Okay. All right. So let's wait just a second. Okay. It's working. So let's talk about some background to William Carey. Okay. Time period, as I just showed you on the chart, the turn of the 19th century. We're entering the 1800s. Yeah. So the United States of America at this time is about how old? And if you go from the Declaration of Independence in 1776, about 34 years old, our country.
Oh, okay, never mind.
But he's not from the US. He's from where? Where'd Carey come from? England. Right. And also at this period of time, something interesting is happening with major Eastern religions and Roman Catholicism. But what I want you to understand is it really amounts to a misinterpretation of what's happening. It appears at this time that Eastern religions are starting to decline and Roman Catholicism is declining because of the impact of the Reformation and all that. But it really is a wrong perception. In other words, at this time, a lot of Protestants think they're actually beginning now to win the world for Christ. Remember that most Protestants believe what about eschatology? What's their position? Are they millennialists? They believe in a literal millennium? No, they don't. Most Protestants are either amillennial, but they're more of a Reformed theology. So in the eyes of many Protestants, we're starting to win the world now. So we're bringing in the kingdom, okay? Problem is that was a little bit short-sighted. Not their fault. I mean, they were limited in their resources. But all you got to do is look back now, 220 some years later, and see that the Eastern religions are very much alive. Hinduism, you talked about, very much alive. Buddhism, which comes from Hinduism, very much alive. And Catholicism is certainly not dead, although a lot of Catholics are really upset with their Pope right now because he seems to be giving into the moral revolution. So anyway, that was the attitude at that time. And this is also something that is easy to misinterpret. The increase in American church attendance. You know what I'm going to do? My neck is getting sore now, so it's either about the sun. This keep me satisfied. You listen back here. That's better. The increase in American church attendance. One of the things that we sometimes do, and I think it's a mistake in our country, we compare the percentage of people going to church now to the percentage that used to go to church 200 years ago. We think, we're really declining spiritually. But can you imagine a fallacy in that thinking? what might be wrong with that?
Just because people go to church doesn't mean they're Christians. Everyone went to church then because that was just the culture. Like how in India, everyone's Hindu because that's just the culture.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't really mean anything necessarily.
Yeah, because most of the colonists came from England or another country in Europe, and going to church was commonplace and expected, right? So you were a good Christian. I don't know how many times when I was growing up, I heard somebody say, oh yeah, he's a good Christian man, which means he's honest, he works hard, got a nice family. You know, I think I told you before, when my parents, sometimes they would have to, if they were applying for something, there were applications that you gave you a checkbox, Catholic or Protestant. Can you imagine somebody filling out an application today in America and being asked, are you Catholic or Protestant? So the fact that people were going to church a lot more is not an indication that America was more spiritual than it is today. I mean, even Ben Franklin, who was a very, very immoral man, I mean, he's a vulgar man, and yet, you know, he talked about the providence of God. Well, that was just part of the language at that time. Everybody used, like, even today, God bless America. What does that mean? It means I want your vote, you know? So don't be surprised. But you see, declining of Eastern religions, Catholicism at least seemingly declining, church attendance rate rising in America. People are starting to draw some conclusions that are premature. Secularization, the state is detached from missionary effort. Now, is that a good or bad thing?
I think it's good because then the government can't, like in Europe, how they're having a lot of issues with Catholicism, like everyone was like forced to be Catholic basically.
They
by the
were,
government.
and some of them in some places. Yeah, that's not true today, I don't think. It probably,
Right, but like back in this
Yeah.
time period.
yes. And even in America, people tried that. They came over to get religious freedom from England, and then they tried to impose their religion, and they punished people that didn't conform. Yes, human nature. Right, the state should be detached from the missionary effort because God's intention was not that the state run the church or that the church run the state, okay? Okay, colonialism, we talked about that quite a bit, all right? When did the Industrial Revolution begin? Well, it's around this time. It actually happens more near the end of the 19th century. And you have a lot of inventions. Tell me, what impact did the Industrial Revolution have on missionary work?
The printing press and part of the Industrial Revolution. That's something else.
Printing press? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a big part of it. Gutenberg Press, right? Have you ever been there to see is the actual original printing press still in Gutenberg, do you know?
I
Okay.
don't know, probably, but I've never been
Yeah,
there.
there's a replica of it in Washington DC that we saw when you used to copy, you know.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
You been there?
Yeah, yeah.
Cool. It's an amazing thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a big factor in it. What else?
Did it start there when they like had trains and stuff so you could travel better and also the streets got better?
Yes,
It made it easier to like travel around.
right. Transportation becomes much easier. I mean, 100 years ago, could you have come to here to study? I mean, just think of the difficulty. And yeah, missionaries going to India taking 3 or 4 months and then not sure they're going to make it. You know, miss the typhoons and the hurricanes and all that stuff. Yeah. And in the Industrial Revolution, time becomes money, right? Efficiency is important. A lot of changes taking place. And one of the big things about missions, when you think of the Industrial Revolution, is what is a missionary? Because before that, pretty much evangelism and church planting, if you're not doing that specifically, you are not a missionary. But with the coming of the revolution, now you've got facility in, you know, like you've got aviation, you've got medical missions and things that can all become, so people begin to ask the question, okay, can this be considered missions? Well, Okay, it's not specifically evangelism and church planting, but they are facilitating it. They're helping to make that possible. And people began to rethink, what is a missionary? And so all of that is a product of the Industrial Revolution. The rise of mission societies, and William Carey is a key player in this one, okay? In fact, he founds what is really called the first modern mission agency. Did you remember, they weren't called agencies back then. Do you remember what the word was that they used to describe these? Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, that is the word societies, excuse me. Just gotta learn to read, that's all. Now we call them agencies, but they were called societies. And why the word society? Because they were very careful not to allow the mission society to compete with the church. The church is the church. A mission society, word society refers to a group of people. So it's a neutral word that if they would have called it the mission board or the mission, whatever, and made it and gave it some sort of authority equal to the church, then you got a problem. So they used a word that was much more neutral, a society. In fact, a lot of churches even used to use that. I don't know if they still do, like for ladies' missionary societies, they used to call them, in churches. Because society is more of a neutral word that doesn't speak of authority. Yeah.
You know why they say agencies today instead of like societies? I don't know if that relates at all.
Yeah, an agent is somebody that works for somebody else, right?
Yeah.
If you're my agent, you're working for me, an insurance agent or whatever. So the idea of an agency is that it's actually working for the local church. The church makes use of agencies. They can send their missionary through an agency. The agency helps, works for them. It's a type of parachurch organization. Para means, coming alongside, next to, same idea. Yeah, that's a good question. Well, Britain plays a key role in this, and partly because Britain has its fingers all over the place, including Matthew, India. The East India Company was a British company. There was in the Netherlands, the British had a company there as well. They were just all over the place. You've heard of the British Empire, right? And you've probably heard the saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire. Well, that was true, because they were so distributed in the world that there was always daylight somewhere in British territory, which didn't make most of the other Europeans very happy. Okay, this comes right out of your book. The significance of Carey's ministry lies in its influence on Protestant missions more than on its influence on the Indian people. Let me just pause on that. That's a really important statement. What's the easiest and most natural way to evaluate how successful a missionary is?
How many people come to Christ?
How many people come to Christ? What else?
Church.
Pardon?
Like if they establish a church.
How many churches did they start? Yeah, or did they start one? Yeah, what else? We tend to evaluate anybody, not just missionary, but anybody, using statistics. We're very statistically oriented, which is not a bad thing in and of itself. But what happens is we oftentimes overlook subtle impact that is going on that we don't see. If we were to evaluate William Carey purely on statistics, how many souls did he win? How many churches did he start? There's no way this guy would have the fame that he does today. He's just an ordinary, everyday missionary. In fact, maybe not even impressive. So this statement that Tucker makes is really good. It's really what he contributed to thought about missions, philosophy of missions. How do we view missions? That's what really makes him who he is today in the history books. He started getting people to think about the idea of mission societies, bringing people together. And we'll talk more about that. But I think that's a good statement. Some of you will be known for the number of things you accomplished. Others of you will be known more in the future by the impact that you had on whatever you're doing. They're two different things, and both of them are important to the Lord. All right. Hey, there's more maps there, Matthew. It's just to compliment what you were giving. You gave us here. Huh?
It's a lot better.
No, that's not. The ones you gave us are really helpful. Man, we talk about this in non-Christian religions class, but you notice that, okay, isn't this gonna work for me, my little button? Come on, you. All right, it's not gonna work. Okay, you see Serampore in the red there. That's where he spent 34 years, the vast majority of his ministry, okay? And notice it's right next to the country of?
Bangladesh.
Right, and actually, I was told that Bangladesh means land of the frogs. So you should say Bangladesh because it means land of the Bengalis. But most people won't know that, so you're okay. But you remember, there was a time when Bangladesh was actually part of India, as was Pakistan. So on both sides up there. And man, this, okay, let's see, you're in there now, in non-Christian religions. You took it? You haven't taken it yet. You're in there, right? No, you're not. You haven't taken it yet. What's the matter? Just kidding. You're in there, and you're not in there. Bunch of guys.
Class, like a,
Yeah, there's some rebel worlds in there. I just thought you were among those guys. Justin Wacker and some of those guys. Yeah, okay. Anyway, so there are most of the concentration of Islamic population is more in the north. Okay, there are Muslims in the south. We were down in Bangalore, which is now called Bengaluru, right there in the south middle. Okay, the Chatlas live in Andhra Pradesh, right about here on the coast. It's a 45-minute flight from Bengaluru over to Vijayawada, where they live. But most of the Muslim population is really more up here. And they wanted to have a state of their own. They wanted to have their own country where they could worship, establish their Muslim faith. So eventually, Pakistan broke off from India, and so did Bangladesh. And this was very recent. In fact, the mission that just passed away recently was actually involved in negotiations to give Bangladesh their independence. Bangladesh is still to this day considered one of the poorest countries in the world, right up there with Haiti and Mozambique, West Africa. Okay, very poor. And Nepal is the only actual Hindu state, country where Hindu is the state religion. You have to be Hindu. Okay, Hindu dominates India, but it's not a state religion, as you mentioned. The radical Hindus today would like to see it become a Hindu state, but the chances of that happening, according to Josh Chatla and another guy I know from Bengaluru, chances of that happening are probably slim, but we'll see. All right. Yeah, this shows you the British influence. Okay, the brown are British territories. Other acquisitions that they made are in orange here. In fact, notice here, I don't know if you can read that, but the word there is Bangalore. That was a word that the British gave to it, but now they've changed it to a more indigenous word, Bengaluru. And the same thing with Mumbai. It used to be known as Bombay. You ever hear of Bombay, India? It's not called Bombay anymore, it's Mumbai, because again, it reflects more of the Indian culture. And there are others. Let me see if I can find it on here. Calcutta. I'm looking for Calcutta.
It's on the right side in the brown.
Yeah, right here. Thank you. And today, is it even on this one? It's okay. It's not on here, but it's now called. I'm sorry, I can't remember. It's similar, but again, it's just like in Burma. Now it's known as Myanmar, which is the more indigenous name. Although I was talking to Van B, and they call it either one. But after the British moved out of these places, they wanted to give them names that were more typical of their people. Interesting, very interesting. Okay, so let's talk about Carey for a few minutes. He was born in 1761 near Northampton, England. And again, you don't have to remember the dates these guys are born, okay? That I'll never ask you for their birthday. He was the son of a weaver, and he later became a shoemaker. And one of the fellow apprentices actually led him to the Lord. Isn't it interesting how many of those people we know so well, but we know nothing about the name of the person who led him to Christ? It's true of a lot of people. I think in heaven, you know, Jesus will, I think it'll be different. He loved botany. The guy he was a genius. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Carey was a genius. In fact, even when he became a missionary, his goal was to use botany as a way to support himself and to teach the Indian people a trade, you know, how to raise their own food. Problem was, he had allergies, and he eventually had to give up his hobby because of the allergies. Yeah. He was a linguist. Matthew, you mentioned 23. I heard 22 official language, but your number is probably more correct. I mean, there's always, it's very possible there are 23. But anyway, he loved linguistics, and he was good at it. And he didn't just translate Bibles in different languages. He translated Bible dictionaries and other tools that people could use. So his early ministry, he actually pastored 2 Baptist churches. He didn't intend to be a missionary at the beginning. And but as he was pastoring them, now look at this. His vision. How do you get a vision for becoming a missionary? Well, he read the works of Captain Cook. Are you familiar with Captain James Cook? He was a British, yeah.
Just because of William Carey, though.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Cook wasn't a believer. Well, I shouldn't say he wasn't a believer, but he's not famous for being a believer. If he was one, he's famous as an explorer. And isn't it interesting that William Carey just got enamored with reading about his explorations, and God used that to give him a desire to travel. I mean, God used everything. So, you know, you could be reading a comic book someday, and, you know, there might be something in it God used. Be careful. You never know. What happened with a group of ministers? This is probably the most famous story about Carey. Do you remember what went on there when he was meeting with a group of ministers?
Wasn't that when they said, when God wants to convert the heathen, he'll do it on his own?
Yeah. So now, she says in her book that, or actually your book, The Great Commission, he says that that's the way the story is told. They're not sure that there's enough historical confirmation to say that's exactly how it happened, but that's the idea. So remember, at this time, the majority of Protestants are not thinking about world missions, not on their radar. They're trying to develop their own works locally and, you know, build up those areas and fight against the Catholic Church. Okay, so he comes along with this idea that no, this is something that we should be thinking about. They're thinking, you know, sit down. So what happens? He responds by writing this. And this is what you guys are going to read for your midterm exam and comment on it. And I'll let you have it there when you're taping in your little essay for the midterm test. I will permit you to have that open. But what I don't want you to do on that is just regurgitate what he's already said. Anybody can do that. I want you to interact with it. How does this strike you? How does this challenge you? So really it's more of a spiritual assignment than it is an academic one. But that's actually, I think that's the full name of it. It's just known now as Carey's Inquiry. By the way, we spell that with an I now, inquiry.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the old English spelling. Yeah, it changed a lot of things. And notice they threw around that word heathen quite a bit. Heathen referred to anybody that wasn't Christianized.
Was it? So when we think of that today, it's kind of like a derogatory term.
It is.
Did they look at it that way and they just thought they were like above these people?
Yeah, there was a lot packed into that. Heathen meant uncivilized, uneducated, uncouth, warlike, you know, just basic, yeah. In some extreme cases, they weren't even truly human beings. They maybe only had a half a soul, or maybe the women in the group didn't have souls at all. I'm just telling you, it's just a lot of really, really strange ideas about it.
What does uncouth mean?
Uncouth is kind of like being no manners, no filter, that kind of a thing. Yeah. Uncouth. That's Ron. No, don't tell him I said that. All right. So, he responds, and when he responds in his inquiry, that thing becomes widely published. People begin to wake up and think about this. And so through that, God enabled him to come in contact with people that became interested in going with him. And so the birth of the Baptist Missionary Society really is the fruit of what he wrote and how well published it was. So that's cool. Well, his wife. And is anybody reading him for any of you reading his account in that book?
I think I
You are?
do. Sure enough.
So I'm not going to steal your thunder, okay? Just, and I'll let you talk more about him when you present him, but his wife, I think that the tendency today is to blame his wife more than to blame him, but Ruth Tucker, I think, does a really good job of bringing it back into balance. She recognizes some neglect on his part, not intentional neglect. He was just so focused on what he was doing, that there were some blind spots regarding his marriage and raising children. He didn't have family class, and all the tools that we have today to help people remember, hey, don't neglect your wife. Remember, your children are part of your ministry. Didn't have all that back then. And so he just got so focused on his work that that doesn't mean that his wife wouldn't have struggled anyway, but she may not have struggled nearly as much. Yeah.
Well, so like, sorry. I don't know, it just like, I'm struggling to understand how he could like neglect a bunch of things in his marriage, and like Tucker talks about him raising his kids and how he just was neglecting a lot of that stuff. And so then like one of the other missionary ladies came in and started caring for his kids. But how could he like, in a sense, fail at that and succeed at something else? And how did like traits from that not carry over and like affect?
That's a really good and searching question. It really is. Because the way that we are trained, and we even hear good messages preached about family and stuff in the scriptures, that is a question that we naturally ask. And this is going to sound like a really shallow answer, but all I can tell you is that God used us in spite of ourselves. Was God pleased by the way he conducted his marriage and his children? I don't think so. Did God shelve him because of that? Did God make him a castaway, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians? No, he didn't. And so I think one question that we cannot answer, Laurel, that would be interesting to ask is, what if he had given attention to his marriage, his family more? What might have happened in his ministry? Nobody knows. It's possible that he would have been known for other things, that happened. I think part of it too, Laurel, is I don't think that he was intentionally, as I mentioned, saying, hey, just get out of the way. I think there was a lack of orientation that doesn't excuse him. But this was true not just of Carey. This was true of a lot of missionary movements. Remember the Moravians? They would sometimes leave their wives and children behind and go for years in a different place to take the gospel. And they saw a lot of spiritual fruit, in spite of the fact that their families were left behind. David Livingstone. We haven't talked about him yet. Rough marriage. Not as bad as this one. John Wesley. Oh, man. Nobody is reading about him. If you read, man, just, it makes you just almost, so that's a good question. I wish I had a better answer for you. But I will say, if you know better and you neglect what you know to be true, you better watch out.
Do you think that just because of the way he lived his life with marriage and stuff, that stuff from that probably carried over a little bit to how he did missions and it's just not really talked about?
Perhaps. There's a lot of stuff in history that we don't have. History is written by flawed historians, and they're going to choose what they want to present. Yeah. Yeah,
Because I feel like today we talk a lot about like morals, like even like a lot of the rules at school make your bed because it teaches discipline. So if you can't be faithful in the little things, you won't be faithful. So
Yeah.
then it's like tempting to read the story and be like, well, he succeeded in other things, like certain things you're not good at, you don't need to work on it because it doesn't really interlap.
yeah, and that's not a good way of looking at it. Yeah. We don't have all this. God was merciful to him by allowing one of his colleagues basically to influence his children toward mission. One of his sons became a very good missionary. And to the credit of his colleague, Josh Marshman, or was it William Ward, one of those two guys, that actually kind of filled in as a father for him. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So yeah, two things. One, we don't know what could have happened if he had been faithful to his family. And two, we also know that God, could we call him an immoral man for that? Well, maybe, but it wasn't like he was living in adultery or that he, intentionally rejected his children. It was more of a passive problem that he had that he might not have even noticed himself. Yeah, that's a searching question. It really is. But whatever we do with that, let's not say, "Oh, well, then God used him, so I don't need to worry about just whatever." That's not a good application. Yeah, good. We're limited in what we have. Well, let's see. Got a couple minutes. Yeah, life in India. Well, living conditions in the interior. It's one thing if he would stay in a capital city, but he didn't because he wanted to get the gospel into the interior of the country. And little Peter dies. I mean, there's so much to this story. That'd be, I do not like you. Okay. Little Peter dies. His wife is pregnant when they come on board, and I mean, there's just so many things that are working against her being a faithful, devoted missionary wife. And Dorothy, some people say, I'm sorry.
Peter's his son?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, he dies. Some people actually say that Dorothy was mentally ill. I don't know that it's really legitimate to say that. Culture shock can do things to you that actually look like mental illness. Okay? Doesn't mean you're mentally ill. It might just be emotional. I view my take on mental illness as something organic. And it may be that what she was dealing with was nothing organic, just the shock of having to adjust to this life. All that. It's time to go. So anyway, yeah, good questions.
In our Baptist history and beliefs class, Dr. Rathbun's wife came in and talked about William Carey's